So our next presenter is Agni Hogaboom, who will present a paper titled The Great Indian Kitchen and the Duluth Wheel, Feeding Work as a Site of Coercive Control. The floor is yours, Agni.
Okay, Jai Janendra, thank you so much, everyone who's been involved in this conference. These have been fantastic presentations. So again, my name is Agni, and I'm with the Veganism, Animals and Ecology Concentration and Engaged Jane Studies. So my work is inspired by the 2021 Malayalam film, The Great Indian Kitchen. It netted 10 industry award nominations and received 9 of those awards. It has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's been well received in India and internationally. So if you haven't seen the film, or if you need a refresh, The Great Indian Kitchen appears at first to be a quiet domestic story about a newly married woman overwhelmed by endless housework, specifically cooking and feeding duties for her groom and father-in-law in a traditional household. As the film unfolds, the food preparation becomes not only her primary occupation during the day, but also the central site of gendered oppression. Her labor is invisibilized, it's increasingly taxing, taken for granted, and treated as her natural duty, while the men of the household's lives, rituals, religiosities, and comforts are prioritized and valorized. The kitchen itself becomes a site of systemic control, interrupted only by her segregation during her menstrual periods, and the segregation further devaluates her personhood. So what might at first seem like an individualized story of domestic inequality escalates into psychological, sexual, emotional, and physical violence, exposing family traditions not as antiquated and slightly flawed, but rather as sophisticated, multivalent strategic systems that normalize domination, particularly through generational, patriarchal, religious, and gender paradigms. So obviously this film was well received. As I said, you can find a lot of blog posts, you can find news articles, you can find some academic papers, a lot of Indian women writing in to say, I live this, or I'm living this now, or my grandmother lived this. So lots of discussion in the academy and in popular culture. But what kind of caught my eye is that there were 2 remakes almost instantly, a Telugu film, The Great Indian Kitchen, 2 years later, and then in 2024, Mrs., a Hindi language film. And my paper does analyze these 3 different films quite a bit and goes into quite a bit of detail because I think the analysis between them is important. I only have time to sort of touch on that. I will say that the film on the left, the original, is almost documentarian in tone. There isn't a sweeping score behind the activities. It's more gritty, it's more realistic. It's a very beautiful film. I highly recommend it. As the films progress, they become increasingly sanitized and increasingly individualized. In other words, this woman just ends up in a bad family and she gets out of it by the end, Mrs. being the most sort of Hollywood version. Another difference I just want to flag briefly is the role of religiosity. So in the first film, the role of religiosity is a major plot point, and it gets absented until it's almost completely gone by the time we get to Mrs. in 2024. Pardon me. So here are my questions. Does the film advance feminist aims? And if so, is it saying anything new? Is Kitchen culturally specific to Indian audiences, or is there a transnational discussion to be had? And does the film inform the field of gendered violence in any impactful way? And the argument I will be making in 12 minutes is that coercive control models are the appropriate tool of analyses for these films, and they represent a more sophisticated and accurate depiction of gendered violence. Mainstream attitudes about gendered violence, both in the popular and mainstream and academic world, have served to stagnate progress. So I won't be reading all of these, but there are 20 primal events of the 3 films. All 3 films have all 20 of these events, and they're important events for the plot. And unfortunately, I think there will be a spoiler or 2 in this presentation. But she does end up in the very last scene of the film. Her groom and father-in-law try to assault her in the kitchen, and she escapes. She throws dishwater on them and quickly locks them out of the kitchen and takes off. And the very last scene of the film is a dance number, actually. And again, if I had more time, I'd love to discuss the differences between the 3 different films' dance numbers. So 20 events in the film that are important to know. There are four sites of narrative I want to focus on today. That is the film's narrative on the kitchen itself, on the role of religiosity, on the groom, and the father-in-law, who you see in the center image here. So the kitchen itself, as somebody who has spent a lot of time doing unpaid feeding work in a kitchen, when you first see the kitchen in the film where she's meeting with her mother-in-law and they're cooking together, it's a pretty cool space as someone who's used the space like that. It's very busy, it's very clean. It's definitely a workspace. It's not a like they're hoofing it, right? They're like chopping things, washing things, preparing these just amazing meals. As the film progresses and the bride is left on her own when the mother-in-law has to take a visit somewhere else, and the bride starts to try to assert some amount of independence, she starts to ask if she can have a job, those kinds of things. The kitchen gets a lot darker. Like you can watch it in the film. Highly recommend you watch this film. The kitchen starts to become, it's the same room, but we start to see it in this more sinister way, including a leak underneath the sink that becomes a major plot point about gendered violence, really. By the end of the film and kind of the darkest era of the film, during her period, she ends up getting segregated from the family in a room, and she's got a cold and she has to sleep on the floor, and she's eating in this separate space while the family has another woman come in and prepare meals. So the kitchen itself is a really lovely narrative device in the film. Second site of analysis here is that of religion and purity. So in all three films, you can see the men in the movie cleansing their body and mind. They're practicing yoga. The father-in-law has this really lovely veranda where he reads his paper and brushes his teeth, and his wife kind of rushes to give him his toothbrush and those sort of things. Meanwhile, the bride, so center image at the bottom, you see her represented with sweat-stained armpits, sticky clothing, untidy hair, and she kind of furtively is spot bathing in the kitchen sink after she does the tremendous amount of labor doing the dishes at night and before she goes to bed. So discussions on intimate partner violence often focus on the groom, the husband, the boyfriend. I feel like he's the least interesting point of analysis in the films. I will just say he is the soft power entity. Like at first, he is sort of seducing and cajoling and praising his bride. And as she gets more recalcitrant, he starts to get more sinister. So I would call him the soft power element. My favorite point of analysis is that of the father-in-law. And I think he is where the coercive control model will start to come into a sharper focus. I did notice that in all of my research, not very many people focused on the father-in-law, and I think he's the most interesting part of the story. In fact, in the first film, he has a total of 8 lines in total, and I did put those in my appendices, and you can see it's very elegantly depicted how he puts pressure on the bride and tries to get her to fall in line with the family system. So how is this relevant? Is this information, is this just, well, that sounds like you enjoyed this film, or is this actually culturally relevant? So I have some statistics. Indian women on average spend 201 more minutes per day on unpaid domestic work than Indian men. In rural areas in particular, women will spend up to 4 to 5 hours per day unpaid labor. In India, women die by fire at a ratio of 3 to 1. And the kitchen itself is a significant source of injury and death, including assaults and homicides. There are actually studies on the kitchen knife itself and how many women have been assaulted, injured, or killed with kitchen knives. A Pew Research Center 2022 meta-analysis reported that crimes against women have nearly doubled between 2010 and 2019. 46% of men, this is a 2012 study with over 10,000 informants, revealed that 46% of married men in northern India reported perpetration of physical or sexual violence or both against their wives in the last year. And finally, what year was the study? I'm not sure. I think it's 2020. An Indian human development study on the last and least phenomenon of women eating last and least canvassed 6,113 ever married women aged 25 and above and found a lot of negative outcomes, including 65% having difficulty thinking clearly and making decisions. And perhaps most distressingly, 44% of them had considered suicide in the last 30 days. And this is, interestingly, only 25% of these 6,113 women were from an underprivileged background. Okay. So let's move into coercive control, which is the model I bring that I think really resonates with this film and is the next generation, so to speak, of domestic violence analyses. This is Evan Stark. He is credited with developing the model of coercive control. He listened to hundreds of domestic abuse survivors who said that the physical violence is not the worst part, and he began more closely cataloging survivor experiences. Like all credible models on domestic violence, he discovers and emphasizes that separation is the most dangerous time for survivors. So, in mainstream and even academic analyses, there's this concept of how do we get this woman to want to leave? But of course, she has like a 76% larger chance of being murdered at the moment her partner starts to perceive that she might be leaving. So, developed separately in the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota, is the Power and Control Duluth model. This is what I wanted to map onto this film. So, if you watch films on domestic violence, and I hope you do watch those documentaries, you might start to see this diagram. Like, look in the background of the offices for domestic violence intervention or social workers. You might see this diagram. So this is the model of coercive control developed. So at the right, we have an egalitarian relationship. So it might have its problems. It might even have some violence. It has strife. It has, sexist concepts of men and women, but it is in a container of nonviolence, and it's going to look like the spokes of this wheel. And don't worry about reading all the fine print. I'm going to go in a tiny bit more detail. At the left is the coercive control model. And all those things inside the spokes, those are the things the abuser is willing to do and is consciously or often unconsciously employing. But the abuser has outside of these spokes, the willingness to commit violence, whether he knows it or not, right? So all of those things in the spoke are all the things that this abuser will do. And violence will be the last resort, but it is all part of a strategic system. So those spokes, those 8 spokes I just showed you, they are so elegantly able to be mapped onto this film, all 3 films actually. So I'm just going to briefly read these. And Ayan talked about the use of pets. They a man who was beating a dog to exert control over his wife and children. That is a perfect example of the square right in the middle, using children, using pets. So using intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, using male privilege, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats. All of those fall short of physical violence, but those are in the spokes of that wheel. So just to give you one example from the film, here at the bottom left, using economic abuse, the bride has no access to a car. She's not really able to spend money. She is not allowed to work. So that's just one example of the system working on the bride. So a little quote from Dr. Emma Katz from a couple years ago. Remember that being violent carries risks for the perpetrator. It is a very obvious act of abuse that might be punished. So if a perpetrator can achieve their goal of completely subordinating and subjugating the victim survivor without using much or any physical violence, that is often what they will do. I want to skip to the very bottom line just in the interest of time. So I think it was the Pew Research Forum found that most Indians believe women should have equal rights, and the vast majority notice that violence against women is a very big problem. So that is kind of that invisible perpetrator that where's this coming from? Where's all this violence coming from? So we need a more sophisticated model rather than thinking of intimate partner violence is like a bad apple. It's one man who doesn't have self-control. It's actually a system that we're all complicit in. Before I get to my conclusions, these are further lines of inquiry if I had more time to invest in this research. These are 3 areas I would like to investigate further. First is how does the last and least eating in the context, in the Indian context, compared to other forms of last and least? For instance, Western cultural and secular dieting behaviors, Ozempic, orthorexia. I would love that cross analysis. Secondly, food and cooking are necessary, and human beings crave nutrition, taste, quality, and novelty. Have previous critiques on feminized food labor been complicit in the cultural and academic devaluation of our desire for hand-prepared foodstuffs and the intensive labor required? In fact, we studied this film in one of my classes, and people would refer to the kitchen work as drudgery. So once you've decided you want the product from the kitchen work, but the work itself is drudgery, you have a labor problem right there. Third point is that queer relationships do demonstrate more egalitarian housework sharing that is well established, but they do not demonstrate lower rates of intimate partner violence. So I'd love to see scholarship on coercive control within queer relationships specifically. So thank you so much. I feel like I had one more point to make. Yes, here it is. Educational materials like the Duluth model are gaining traction in law, public policy, domestic violence, nonprofits, and projects, in the academy, in podcasts, blogs, and broader media think pieces. These updated models of domestic violence match the independent convergence of transnational and transcultural artistic projects. So, like these films, like the film No Ordinary Love from 2019, Alice Darling from 2022, and Men from the same year. So the kitchen original and the remakes, but also the reception of each, provide a qualitative and cultural acid test. Despite Mrs. attempts, that's the third film, despite its attempts at a sanitized, individualized, and secularist approach, the original film stands head and shoulders above in both critical and popular acclaim. This results suggest we are ready for a spicier bite of this conversation on domestic abuse. And I have a brief partial reference list. These are what I would read if you were further interested. And I want to thank you for listening.